Contention 2 is combating the meat industry. Leland, the Independent 06, writes that the rapidly growing meat industry is the #1 proponent of climate change. Not only does it take enormous amounts of fuel to create fertilizer and produce meat, but these domestic animals belch and fart enormous quantities of greenhouse gas, which is 20 times more detrimental to the atmosphere than normal CO2. Fortunately, a carbon tax would be able to prevent these harms. Gauzen of the Telegraph 15 writes that a carbon tax on meat products would be the most effective policy option for government to reduce domestic meat consumption, prevent obesity, and alleviate adverse environmental effects. That's why Gauzen concludes that the livestock sector accounts for 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is the same amount of emission from cars, planes, trains, and ships combined. A carbon tax on meat would have 2 impacts. The first is benefiting health. Gauzen again finds that carbon tax would reduce nationwide consumption by 14%, therefore less people will become obese. And second is through decreasing emissions. The Center for Food Policy 15 writes that a Swedish tax introduced on meat products reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 12%. Contention 3 is multilateralism. A U.S. carbon tax would spur multilateralism in 3 ways. First is by increasing leverage. According to Condon from the OECD 13, a carbon tax would lead to the border adjustments, which is where price of exports increases. This increase in trade prices as a result of a carbon tax is used as leverage to force other countries to participate in climate change agreements and change domestic climate policies. That's why Jacob from Potsdam Institute 12 writes that carbon tax would lay the foundation for international cooperation. And second is by setting a precedent. Roberts of Grist Magazine 12 writes that if U.S. were to adopt a carbon tax, other countries would follow suit. This would set a precedent for other countries, as Morris of the Center of Climate Solutions 14 explains that such a policy would indicate a transparent level of U.S. efforts to other countries. Third is by breaking the ice. According to Taylor of Niskanen Center 15, U.S. action is necessary for effective global response. According to Etzatoni of George Washington University, developing countries would be much more willing to sign a carbon tax if the U.S. spearheads an effort to break the ice. Hence, unilateral action is the only way to get other countries to work together. And that's why empirically in 2014, the World Bank finds that 74 countries over 1,000 businesses that emit 52% of worldwide emissions have come together, signaling they are ready to work together to bring down emissions and support carbon pricing. Multilateral efforts result in 3 impacts. The first is saving lives. According to the WHO, a carbon tax would prevent the loss of 3 million premature deaths each year. Second is decreasing carbon emissions, where Balzerani of GMU in 2013, in a meta-analysis of 61 studies, finds a carbon tax would be able to cut emissions by 13% in the long term, and thus reaffirm.
Definitions. According to the World Bank, a carbon tax is an explicit form of carbon pricing. Framework. Observation 1. The affirmative team cannot pick and choose any random carbon tax. They must defend the way that it would actually be implemented in the United States. According to Bloomberg in 2015, the most recently congressionally proposed carbon tax starts at $45 per ton, increasing by 2% annually. Observation 2. The affirmative team version is not to just show that a carbon tax is a good idea, but that it should be adopted on a national scale. As such, if there exists a better alternative with less risk and more reward, then a carbon tax should not be adopted. Contention 1, states should implement a carbon tax. By implementing a federal tax, the United States would force everyone in the U.S. to pay the exact same tax rate. This prevents individual states from creating a carbon tax that best suits them. That's why, according to the Carbon Tax Center in 2016, starting out with a carbon tax on a state-by-state basis is a much better option than trying to pass a carbon tax on the federal level. There are a few distinct reasons why this is the case. First, according to Northwest Economic Research Center in 2016, many states already have energy tax infrastructure set up, so it would be much more efficient for states to implement a carbon tax. Second, states can best use carbon tax revenue to improve their problems. For instance, the Christian Science Monitor in 2015 finds that Washington could use the revenue to change its highly regressive sales tax code, and Huffington Post in 2013 reports that New York could use revenues to help reinforce state infrastructure to withstand future storms. Contention 2, cutting subsidies. According to economist A.P. Heard in 2012, a new carbon tax would overburden an already crumbling IRS. According to Bloomberg in 2015, the IRS's budget has fallen by $1.2 billion and employment has been cut by 11%. As a result of these inefficiencies, the IRS closed 46,000 less audits compared to the previous year. According to Jack Calder from the IMF, in 2015, a carbon tax would have a major impact on the resources and skills required by the IRS. Setting up a new tax system on the federal level would only exacerbate these inefficiencies, meaning less revenue is collected for the government. However, the U.S. can achieve the exact same benefits from a carbon tax without setting up a new tax system. According to Oil Change International in 2014, the U.S. heavily subsidizes large polluting industries. Specifically, the fossil fuel industry receives $37 billion worth of subsidies each year. Because of this, carbon-emitting companies operate with climate-harming practices at a much smaller cost. OCI furthers that removing these subsidies forces companies to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Cutting subsidies achieves the same goal of reducing emissions without the inefficiencies of the IRS. Concretely, the IMF in 2015 projects that cutting subsidies would raise government revenue by $2.9 trillion while slashing premature deaths from pollution by over 50%, saving countless lives. Contention 3, a shift to green technology. As it stands, alternative energy represents a mere 10% of total U.S. energy consumption. However, a carbon tax doesn't solve this problem. According to the IMF in 2011, demand for fuels such as gasoline are inelastic, meaning despite the price, people will always buy fuel. As economist Kevin Drum in 2011 says, it takes massive price increases to significantly reduce the demand for oil, even over a 20-year horizon. That's why empirically, Philip Cross in 2015, chief economic analyst at Statistics Canada, finds that despite a carbon tax, fuel consumption in British Columbia remained the same. However, instead of adopting a carbon tax, the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2009 find that the U.S. can instead require electric utilities to directly increase their use of renewable electricity. At 25%, carbon emissions would be reduced by 277 million metric tons per year. As a result of this new scramble for alternative energy, UCS furthers that this would increase investment for renewable energy companies by $263.4 billion. A carbon tax does not have that effect. The Breakthrough Institute in 2012 concludes that a carbon tax would only offer 1/2 to 1/50 incentive to innovate and is 10 times costlier. The U.S. federal government should not waste resources on a carbon tax that won't work when they could instead simply require companies to shift to green technologies, thus we negate. We're going to take a few seconds, right? Okay, that was 10 seconds. Do you mind if I take the first question?
Sure. Go ahead.
Alright. So is everyone ready? Everyone's good? Alright. So in your constructive, you said that 74 countries are working together to stop climate change, right?
Yes.
So then what's the point of a carbon tax?
So the whole point is that taking this step of implementing a carbon tax is taking it to the next level. So you're basically saying that these companies are ready to cooperate, and what we're going to do with the carbon tax is actually implement it, and so we'll get this positive policy
But
change.
if they're already taking the necessary steps to combat climate change, that's what you said,
No,
then
so
what's the point of a carbon tax?
what we're saying is these 74 countries are ready to come to the table. They're not implementing it themselves. They're ready to come to the table. They've shown that they are willing, and in order to do this carbon tax, and that's why the U.S. taking this unilateral action will spur them as well,
Alright,
and
so
they are ready to
so
work
that's
together.
on that point, right? Why would a developing country who cares about developing put climate above their own economy? Why would they be willing to implement a carbon tax?
So what we're saying is that the United States, with their unilateral action, spur this. When the United States puts forth this carbon tax, we put forth this positive mechanism for actually solving for climate change.
But again, why will they choose their climate over their economy? Because a carbon tax would only hurt them in the long run if they're developing, because they rely so heavily on fossil fuels.
Okay, so what we actually show you is the carbon tax will actually prevent it. So it will actually help with their development, right? So we're saying that so it'll be a multilateral effect, and that's like one of the things that Vince will extend in the speaker. Can I get the next question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the negative world, what will happen without this carbon tax?
What will happen without this carbon tax? What we're essentially trying to say is that when the United States is deciding to adopt a certain policy to remove climate change or cut down carbon emissions, a carbon tax doesn't have that effect because there are better alternatives that we can do.
And what is
instead.
this time frame on the alternatives?
What is this time frame? It would be the exact same time frame as a carbon tax.
Okay.
It's like the only way we can actually look towards different policies and see which one we should adopt is look towards the pros and cons of these policies that are in effect. That's what we're showing you.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So you talked about how, or let's talk about obesity, right?
Okay.
So how many people are we going to save from obesity due to a carbon tax?
So what we're saying is that with the carbon tax, it's going to be a carbon tax on, like, if you look to meat, right? This will actually decrease emissions and prevent people from obesity, which is like a health benefit, right?
Sorry, is your final solvency meaning we're going to stop eating meat in the U.S.?
No, we're just going to increase the price, so it kind of disincentivizes people from purchasing. Can I actually get the next question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what is the purpose of the IRS?
The IRS?
Yeah.
To collect tax revenue.
Okay, so are you saying that we should never, like, pass a tax again because the IRS is inadequate?
No, what we're saying is that by cutting subsidies, we can just remove the IRS from the picture. Because the IRS is already being overburdened, there's no point to just adopt a policy that would harm them, when instead we can do something different and leave the IRS out of the picture.
So why is this unique to
Because a carbon tax would harm the IRS, whereas cutting subsidies, it wouldn't harm the IRS at all. It doesn't go through the IRS.
Okay, that's fine. So that's
All right, sure.
Can I see your second observation?
Nice. What do you mean?
Like I just like see the narrative.
Okay.
So I'll be going with overview, then straight down to this. Before diving into the affirmative case, keep in mind one specific overview. When you look to the NOAA, they actually find that if the United States doesn't try to stop climate change right now, then it's going to be too late. At that point, you're always going to be preferring the affirmative because we're the ones giving you the probability of solvency. In the affirmative world, we pass the legislation that helps the environment. In the negative world, we do nothing. At that point, let's go down their case. And their framework, they first talk about how we can't pick and choose a policy. Two responses here. First, realize that the resolution never specifically says anything about a specific carbon tax in the United States. That specifically means that Zona not just have to defend the merit of a carbon tax and tell you why that's good, and we're telling you that it helps the environment. But second of all, realize that we can look to historical precedent. When you look to carbon taxes in other countries, we can look at what they've done, and we can replicate that in the United States, which creates a lot of benefits. But now, let's go to their first contention, which talks about how states can implement a carbon tax. There are a lot of responses here. First, realize that a state and national carbon tax can happen at the exact same time. They don't prove a trade-off. But second of all, look to Harvey from the Washington Post in 2015, who writes that a state carbon tax has never been proposed, so at that point, they don't give you any probability of this actually happening. But third of all, there isn't any incentive for states to pass a carbon tax by legislation, because when you look historically, what the New Yorker in 2015 actually finds that only 10 states have a cap-and-trade system with federal encouragement. At that point, they need to show to you why a carbon tax with federal encouragement is going to happen in the states. But fourth of all, look to the Carbon Tax Center in 16, who find that they need to prove that each tax will be the exact same thing, because if they don't show you that within the states the taxes are the same, then these companies are just going to move from state to state with the lowest carbon tax that uniquely creates carbon outsourcing, which means that overall you're increasing emissions with the state carbon tax. But fifth of all, you realize when you look at the Carbon Tax Center in 16 again, they actually find that a state carbon tax will uniquely also create national outsourcing because of the fact that these companies can just move to other states. But now, let's go to their second contention, and once they talk about how subsidies are going to be really beneficial, there are going to be a lot of responses here also. First, realize that they never show the probability of this actually happening. What Sonia and I would contend is that it's never happened before. Don't let them tell you that you can just take money away from subsidies and move it into into a carbon tax. But second of all, realize that when you look at the IRS's job is literally to collect taxes. They literally never show you why we shouldn't implement a carbon tax when it's literally the IRS's job to do so. And they're literally saying that we shouldn't impose any taxes at all because the IRS is too overstretched. But third of all, it's not unique to the debate because it's not a problem with a carbon tax, it's a problem with the IRS. At that point, they don't generate any unique offense. But fourth of all, they never show you why subsidies and taxes can happen at the same time. We perm the alternative because in the affirmative world, we can tell you that we can pass a carbon tax and still take money away from the subsidies that they're talking about. But now, let's go to the third contention, which essentially talks about green technology, and they talk to you about how when we have a carbon tax, we prevent green technology. Two responses here. First, look to Brookings and 14, who writes that a carbon tax will actually increase the incentive to develop green technology, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. At that point, we're specifically showing you that there's more development in green technology, and in the long term, we're going to be benefiting the environment. But furthermore, when you invest in green technology, it creates jobs. Look to the evidence that Sonia Reed's case, which specifically says that when you look at the example of Washington, we created 7,000 jobs. That specifically shows you that it's going to be really beneficial. But second of all, realize that you can cross-apply third contention to this argument. We're telling you that with a multilateral carbon tax, our evidence from the World Bank actually finds that a carbon tax in the status quo would just spearhead efforts. The reason being is because our evidence says that countries and the leaders in the international community are signaling to other developing countries that they need to actually help the environment, and therefore they're going to pass policies to help them. But then, while I was prepping them out, I actually know that they're going to come up here and read carbon outsourcing, therefore we're going to put two responses there. First, look to the IPA in 2015 actually find that the scope of this is really small. Realize that they find that only 15% of the international large corporations, only 15% of the carbon emissions are from industrial emissions. So at that point, 85% of all the emissions stay within the United States. So the 15% that they're talking about in carbon outsourcing is going to happen elsewhere. Our balance for winning the argument. But second of all, they're going to talk about how outsourcing is really bad. However, you can look at the University of San Francisco, who finds that outsourcing creates mutual economic benefits and creates jobs. Thank you.
Can we get a case back, by the way?
Sure.
Also, can I see the 74 countries thing?
Sure.
You just showed them.
So it's right here in the corpus.
First, an overview. The first essential burden of the affirmative team is to show that a carbon tax is actually a good idea. If a carbon tax is bad, vote neg. But second, we should weigh short-term impacts over long-term theoretical predictions, because if the economy crashes tomorrow, we never get to the hypothetical benefits in 20 years. For example, when constructing a house, planning to build a nice roof doesn't matter if the foundation crumbles before you get there. With that established, let's go straight into the affirmative case. Under the first contention about the economy, they argued that a net revenue tax is going to be successful. Now, first things first, I need to point out a contradiction here. They say in their last speech that a state has never implemented a carbon tax, yet as their empiric for this contention, they read the carbon tax that was implemented in Washington and say it created jobs. Kind of an important contradiction to point out. But second, the problem with the net revenue tax is that it actually harms the economy. In fact, the Energy Independence Association finds that a carbon tax would devastate the US economy because every year, things like transportation infrastructure does not have a green alternative. There's no such thing as a solar-powered 18-wheeler or a solar-powered train. As a result, transportation costs will go up, increasing the prices of all goods across the board. As a result, the Center for Energy Solutions explains that this would eventually kill 1 million jobs and $1 trillion of GDP growth by 2030. But second, the Institute of Public Affairs finds that a carbon tax would increase the average household's energy bill by $150 per month. That's just energy. McKinsey finds that this would push the 40% of Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck into a spiral of poverty that they cannot escape. The problem with their contention is that when they tell you that poorer families are making $1,000 a year, they don't do any comparative analysis. When on balance, families have to pay more than what they receive from this net revenue model, they're still going to get hurt by the carbon tax. But next on to their second contention about the meat industry. Second impact. The biggest problem with this is, as Ali points out in Crossfire, they have zero quantifiable impact on how many less people are going to be getting obese. This impact doesn't really make sense because they never quantify it. But additionally, the cutting of agricultural industries such as meat, etc., is actually really bad. Because as the USD finds, this would force us to nearly double our import of food, or else 1 in 9 people will go without food. Essentially, when farms are no longer producing as much food as they normally would, this gets rid of a US surplus. It makes it harder and harder for the poor families to get the access to food that they need to survive. That makes sense. Now let's look at their second impact here, where they talk about how this is going to reduce greenhouse gases. Now I'm going to kind of group this together with their multivan. Now, as Vincent correctly points out, I'm going to talk about carbon leakage. According to Joseph Aldi in 2012, a public policy professor at Harvard, a carbon tax causes carbon-emitting companies to simply move the production of goods abroad in order to avoid the tax, which actually leads to an increase in emissions outside the US. That's the first internal link. But the second, additionally, reducing demand for US fossil fuels reduces their global price, making fossil fuels more attractive in unregulated countries. This is really important because as economist Kress explains in 2014, the problem with developing countries right now is that they favor their economy over their climate. Essentially, a developing country will never want to implement a carbon tax if it will nerf their economy. As a result, they're going to be buying more gasoline in the global market. As a result, Mustafa Babiger finds that for OECD countries, carbon leakage will actually result in a net increase of 30% in carbon emissions, making climate change even worse. But now onto some of the specific links here. When they tell you that there's going to be things such as like border adjustment, the problem with this contention is that that's actually not really likely to happen in the real world. The problem with the border adjustment policy is that, as the University of Chicago points out, while it is practical in theory, border tax adjustments are likely to be difficult to implement. The regulations custom agents would have to effectively understand would result in an inefficient and failing process. The same study figures furthers that implementing a border tax adjustment would conflict with World Trade Organization law, so it's not even legal. Thus, the intended effect of a border tax would never materialize and is not a policy that can be evaluated in conjunction with a carbon tax. So when you look at the short term and you see that there's clear economic detriment, as well as the long term even on the climate, we show you how the negative is one on both.
First question.
Actually, you guys got the first question last time. Sure. Okay, so before the round of security said that you have to read dates, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you read any dates in your rebuttal?
Might be. Do you want me to do it?
No, I'm just asking you, right? Like,
They're all from like
you don't read
2014.
any dates in your rebuttal.
They're all from like 2014.
Specifically, right?
They're all-
Okay, so all of them from 2014.
Sure.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Would you like the question?
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna ask the question. So, real quickly, let's talk about like poor families, right? You say that they'll make like $1,000 extra from the carbon tax.
Yeah.
Do you do any comparative analysis on how much money they'll be making on balance?
No, I'm just telling you that, like, when you look to, no, I don't do any comparative analysis,
Okay.
right? But the evidence that I read to you, which links into your outsourcing link, specifically says that we create mutual economic benefits.
I
So
understand.
having a job and getting an income is
So
better than not
My
having a
second
job.
question then is, if people are making $1,000 a year, but that is heavily offset by the increased price of goods, services, electricity, etc.,
Yeah.
and they're actually losing money,
I
how
would
does
say,
that help?
I would
them?
say that we circumvent those harms because the San Francisco evidence that I read to you specifically says that we're creating jobs, right? Having a job is better than having like no job.
Again, like-
Can I get a question now? Leland?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about like state taxes, right?
Sure.
Are the state taxes all going to be the same, or do these states have the discretion about how
So as we point out, the federal tax would be the same value, right?
Yeah.
That's not good because each state should set their own carbon
Why?
tax. Because it's whatever works best for them.
Doesn't that create
Hold on,
carbon
it's-
leakage
when-
though?
No, it doesn't.
Between why? Like logically, right? If I'm in
Right.
California
I
and
agree
they
with
charge $100 per ton of CO2, and in Florida they charge $1 per ton of CO2, why would I
First of all,
produce
that's
in
not,
California?
first of all, that's not how it would work. But second, even if
Why?
that's the case, look,
It's
you don't
different,
evaluate
right?
leakage in today's round because like we're still totally good. The key thing here is that like carbon emissions as a whole, leakage, right? That occurs no matter what, whether it's a state thing or it's a federal.
No, I'm saying a
Now, let me
state
ask you
thing.
a question.
No, I'm saying a state thing
Let me ask you a
uniquely,
question.
it uniquely increases carbon outsourcing within states. But yeah, you get a question.
Alright, cool. So real quickly, how many more people are going to be obese if
Um,
the industry?
Well, I can't quantify to you how many people are going to be less
You
obese,
can't
but I can quantify to you the fact that there's a 14% decrease in consumption.
Right.
Obviously,
So,
people are eating less, they're going to be less obese.
Sorry, obviously if people are eating less, they're not going to be obese, right? So what about the poor, like the poorest people, who they go to the market and their meat prices is way jacked up because it costed so much more to produce?
Wait.
If they can't buy that meat, like,
They can,
Well, they
they
can
can buy
start-
the meat. They can buy the meat through the jobs that they get through outsourcing.
so let's
Can I
say,
get a question now?
can you explain that outsourcing thing like first?
Yeah. So when you have
How does
outsourcing,
you
you create mutual economic benefits. But can I get a question now?
Wait,
We can talk about this
If
one.
you're outsourcing U.S. jobs, right?
No,
how does
and
it benefit?
create jobs inside the United States also.
Which
so it's
jobs?
gonna what?
Which jobs?
Like overall, can I get a question now? Actually, so no, we can do that
Overall.
evidence.
Okay, that's
In
fine.
response.
Yeah.
So let's talk about multilateralism, right?
Sure.
You're talking about carbon outsourcing. So how much of the industrial emissions happen in the United
Okay,
States?
so the problem with that is that's just the
How
first-
much?
That's look,
Like a number.
look, we can agree with your link, it's 50%.
Okay,
Hold on,
50%,
just a second.
okay.
The thing is, you ignore the second internal link, right? Like, for example, like, developing countries favor economics over climate. They're not going to adopt a carbon tax. They're going to increase usage of gasoline.
So you have 130,000.
Yeah, can I, oops.
What?
Can I get that jobs thing?
Oh. Yeah, I'll.
The outsourcing?
movement fund purposes.
Oh, so, okay, yeah. You want to finish after the summary?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so just as an alternate roadmap, I'll be going over the framework and observations, and then I'll be going over like a couple main responses, and then the major voting issues for today. Everyone ready? First with framework, remember the NOAA evidence that tells you that the United States doesn't do anything about climate change by 2040 is going to be too late. And this outweighs because climate change is irreversible and it affects everyone globally, and therefore you always need to prefer the affirmative because we actually give you a probability of solvency, and again, we can also look to other countries and historical precedent to make effective carbon tax. Next on the responses, they first of all say that states can implement the carbon tax, but first, state and national carbon taxes can happen at the same time. They are not mutually exclusive. Second, they also need to prove that they say they need to prove that carbon tax will happen the same overall, but the only way to actually do that is through multilateralism and extending that impact. And third, with federal encouragement, the states still cannot pass this carbon tax individually. Next, they talk about cutting subsidies first. Again, they never show probability. And second, they talk about the IRS, which is non-unique because it's an internal problem of the IRS and has nothing to do with the carbon tax. Next, they move on to green technology, but cross-apply from our case with Brookings and 14 evidence that shows that there's incentives for green technology will actually result in a carbon tax and cause a 2.9 million job increase. And second, look to multilateralism. The U.S. actually needs to spearhead an effort to signal that carbon tax policies are good and efficient. And lastly, they mention outsourcing, but remember two things. Because it tells you that 85% will still come from the public, and therefore a carbon tax can solve for those emissions. And second of all, also remember that outsourcing is mutually beneficial because it actually creates a 72% increase in jobs. Next, on to the voting issues. The first is economics. Extend the fourth evidence, which again tells you that 2.9 million jobs will be created as a result of green technology. And you can look to Washington, where 7,000 jobs have been created. And also now onto multilateralism. They say that developing countries favor their own economy, but that doesn't matter because the World Bank actually finds that businesses in 74 countries have come together and signaled they are working to fight climate change and will spur green technology so we can circumvent that harm. And the impact of that is that we save lives internationally because the WHO evidence says that with unilateral carbon tax spurring multilateral efforts, we can actually prevent 3 million premature deaths. And that's reaffirmed.
Okay, we'll take our.
But you,
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry.
you want every card, right?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
the rule.
I just want to see your dates.
No, yeah, like, yeah.
Yeah, just whatever was from the law.
Okay.
Want us to like circle it for you or something?
Okay, it's all there.
Alright, we have a minute 50 French. Okay. we have 20 seconds remaining.
20?
Yeah.
So, really quick off time. I'm going to go one overview, then two voters on econ and climate. That is everyone ready? Alright, let's begin. Really quick, the alternative debate of our case doesn't even matter because our opponents haven't proven the first burden that they have to prove, which is that carbon tax is a good idea. Until they prove that a carbon tax is a good idea, we can't even look towards other alternatives. With that, we're going to move on to the first voter issue of today's debate, which is going to be on economy. And remember, they don't respond to the fact that we must look towards the short term over the long term, because if our economy crashes tomorrow, it doesn't matter what other long-term hypothetical projections that they talk about. With it, let's move right into it. Now, really quick, their evidence that talks about how we're going to see an increase in jobs, it's not even about a carbon tax, it's about economic globalization. At that point, none of their impacts are actually going to come through. If you want to see the card, you can call for the card because it doesn't actually talk about carbon tax. That's why you have to be preferring our evidence, which tells you specifically that a carbon tax increases the prices of all goods because transportation increases. This really hurts the poor because when there's 40% of people are living paycheck to paycheck and prices are only increasing, they're not able to buy the proper goods and services. That's why you prefer the EIA, which tells you we're going to on net lose 1 million jobs and a decrease in our GDP by $1 trillion. Now they try to argue the fact that at least we're saving people, at least we're not going to have any more obese people. But the problem with that is that the reason why they're not going to be obese is because they're starving. Remember, the USDA finds out 1 in 9 people won't be without food. At that point, none of their impacts are actually coming through. But even if we don't believe that the economy is harmed in the short term, they don't win on the climate, specifically the carbon leakage point. Now they talk about this 2042 tipping point. Remember, a carbon tax only pushes us closer to that tipping point because global emissions increase. Now, as Vincent stated, yes, U.S. companies will move outside because it's cheaper, but what he forgets, and more importantly, that because the U.S. demand of oil decreases, the global price decreases. So developing nations are buying this oil, and overall, that's why the Beaker finds on net increase in emissions by 30%. That means overall emissions are increasing. So at that point, their multilateral contention doesn't really stand because when they can see that these countries aren't actually doing anything in the status quo, that's why you prefer open capitalism. They won't do it because they prefer their economy over their climate. At that point, none of their climate impacts come through because global emissions increase. So at that point, a carbon tax not only harms us in the short term with our economy, but harms us in the long term with our climate is decreasing.
Can I see my evidence?
Yeah.
Can I ask the first question? Yeah? Okay. So just to clarify again, so you said 74 countries are starting to do it.
No, because
have they done
it
anything?
says, no, that's not what it said. It says that international leaders in the global community are signaling to these countries.
They're signaling.
Yes.
Have they done anything?
No, because we haven't.
Oh, they
haven't.
Yeah, what base? Can you just give me the logical reason why a developing nation will choose to switch over to climate-saving practices instead of focusing on their economy and development?
Okay, so Sonia reads you in summaries that we can circumvent those harms because you never respond to, I believe it's Forbes evidence, which specifically says that with the carbon tax, you not only promote green technological innovation in the United States, but you promote it elsewhere.
I don't think you understand that good.
But, okay,
I'm going,
okay,
hold on a second.
actually-
Vincent, look, I'm the president of Myanmar, okay? I'm going through a developing phase. My country is going through an industrial revolution.
Yeah.
Why will I shift my dependence on fossil fuels randomly over to green technology and a carbon tax when that harms my economy and slows my development? Why would I do that?
No, wait. So one, the 74 countries, you never specifically proved that these 74 countries are developing countries. But two, it's empirically happened. These 74 countries have already signaled that they want to
wait,
Yeah, that's fine. You can
You guys have been at my talk for like a minute. Okay. So you talk about how my evidence doesn't talk about, you talk about globalization, right?
Yeah.
Did you read the sentence after it?
The card
It talks about
literally
outsourcing,
economic
right?
global-
Yeah.
So we
it talks about
agree,
outsourcing. Which we talked
the card talks about outsourcing, yes, but the causal link for this outsourcing is economic globalization.
Yeah, so
Economic globalization is not a carbon
Okay.
tax.
That was last year's talk.
Globalization causes
That
outsourcing.
was last
This is that
February.
carbon tax caused
Last
outsourcing.
February.
We're
Okay.
still guarding the impacts, right?
No, you're not.
Because
Why?
you're not, because the link isn't there. You're just proving that economic
No,
globalization
okay,
is
so we
good.
can both agree then, we can both agree that carbon outsourcing happens,
No.
right?
No.
Okay,
No.
so it doesn't
So it
happen.
doesn't happen.
Okay,
Carbon
perfect. You guys
outsourcing.
get a question
Vincent, let me answer, right? Look,
Sure.
Carbon outsourcing is very different from outsourcing caused by globalization.
So what's
okay?
different
The
about it?
difference is a carbon tax has unique harms to the economy that you don't mention, and that's not covered in globalization.
No.
Specifically, the internal links of
Which
raising
economy?
prices of
Which
goods.
economy?
The U.S. economy.
Okay, so then the other countries are still benefiting, right?
No.
Why?
Okay. Again, I'll go back to the Myanmar example, right?
Sure.
Like, when I have to put a carbon tax on my country, when I have to switch to green tech instead of pursuing a cheaper fuel alternative, that harms my growth. That makes logical sense. But the bigger thing is, when economic globalization happens, that doesn't increase the prices of goods or services, right?
What do you mean?
Like, it doesn't increase the prices of goods and services in that country specifically, right? Because in the US, we see, for example, energy prices increase by $150 each month. That doesn't happen.
But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because that's still offset by the job that we create.
But that jobs that you're assuming that those jobs are just created out of thin air and that there's no cost to them.
We show you exactly in Washington 7,000 jobs have been created. Like, we're not just pulling the statistic out of thin air, we can give you the evidence.
Reasons not to vote for them, and then 2 reasons to vote for us. Okay. First overview, remember in rebuttal, they say that all of their evidence is 2014. I encourage you to call for it. It's not from 2014. They literally lied to you. But second of all, realize that they say that we need to show that it's a good idea. However, Sonia and I specifically tell you that a carbon tax is a good idea because it helps the environment and helps the economy. What the NOA evidence says specifically is that by 2042, if we don't do anything, then we can't solve for climate change, and that's going to be too late right there. At that point, in the affirmative world, we're passing a piece of legislation that can help the environment. But in the negative world, we don't do anything, and it's going to be really hard to do something by 2042, so you're always preferring the probability of solvency. But then, reasons not to vote for them. First, they tell you that states can implement this tax. However, realize that they never respond to one, national and state taxing actually coexist. But two, they need to refute that all the carbon taxes across the states are going to be the same. Because we're telling you that if they're not the same, then these companies might go from one state that has a higher carbon tax to another state that has a lower carbon tax, which uniquely creates outsourcing. But then they talk about how we're cutting cutting subsidies from other places. However, one, they never show you the probability of this, but two, it's literally a problem with the IRS, not a carbon tax, and we're only showing you that the idea of a carbon tax is really good. But then they talk about how carbon outsourcing is really bad. However, remember the evidence that I read to you, which says that industrial emissions from the United States only accounts for 15% of all the United States pollution. At that point, 85% of the emissions actually stay within the United States, so at that point, you can mitigate their impact. But furthermore, our evidence tells you that outsourcing uniquely creates jobs. Our evidence tells you that there's mutual economic benefits, and by putting it harms the poor. However, when they create jobs, having a job is better than having no job at all. At that point, they can afford goods. But then, 2 reasons to vote for us. First, on green tech. They never respond to the internal link, which is that when you have a carbon tax, you can actually develop green technology in the long term, which is why a lot of countries are doing it right now. But second of all, you can vote for us off of multilateralism. They never respond to the third warrant in our third contention, which talks about breaking the ice. That's why the World Bank evidence finds that 74 countries have signaled that they are going to solve for climate change right now, and the United States needs to spearhead an effort in order to get them to do this. At that point, realize that overall, we saved 3 million lives, and lives are irreversible. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll be taking 20 seconds to prep. First on the overview, remember that the alternative debate does not matter today if the affirmative does not prove their first essential burden. Is a carbon tax a good idea? Here's why it isn't. On to the first voting issue of the economy. Nowhere in the debate do my opponents answer the fundamental argument as to how you're going to be weighing today's round. Remember that you have to prefer the short-term economic detriments over the long-term theoretical predictions, because if the economy crashes tomorrow, it doesn't matter what happens 20 years from now. Here's why we're winning on the economy. Their only evidence when they talk about how outsourcing is going to be effective is about economic globalization. It has literally nothing to do with the carbon tax. Prefer our internal warrant for why a carbon tax harms the economy. Remember that when you're increasing the price of goods and services for the general people, that'll push the 40% of the ones living on a paycheck-to-paycheck basis into a further cycle of poverty. Specifically, you can remember that there's going to be an increase of a loss of jobs by, on balance, 2.1 million jobs, as well as an on balance decrease of the GDP by $1 trillion. At that point on the economy, you're going to be flowing back to the negative. But additionally on lives, remember that you're also going to be spiking up the prices of food. And so far as they never respond to the evidence that the USDA finds that we're going to be unable to feed 1 in 9 people, it doesn't matter if those people are no longer obese if they're starving to death. At that point, you're going to be voting for the negative. But even if you want to look at the long-term 2042 argument of the climate, we're still winning this. Carbon outsourcing does not matter. The most important link here is that when the global demand for oil falls, it causes the price of oil to increase as a whole. Now the reason why there are evidence about 74 countries, the reason why they're only signaling to do something but not actually following through is because a carbon tax would have an effect on their economy. Remember Crass, who tells you that for developing nations, the chief concern is their economy. And when the price of fossil fuels drops, it's a more attractive option to those countries. As a result, the consumption of fossil fuels will increase, causing carbon emissions to spike by 30% globally. At that point on lives, even in the long term, even if we save 2 million American lives, you're just going to be killing 3 million others across the world. And for those two reasons, we urge a negative vote.